I want to welcome everybody to another installment of our virtual church service here online. I don't know how many more of these will have to happen. I hope that there are not many more of them. I would love to be just back to normative church gathering, but this is another Sunday where we cannot. I want to consider today, as we look forward, going forward in Jesus' trajectory here toward the crucifixion, where all of human history is going to come to a very fine point. I want to take a moment to reflect on the situation in which we are right now with COVID and all that has happened. The wheels of history are set in motion. How much of those wheels of history God actually orchestrates, or that God allows to happen and then utilizes the movements in order to accomplish what He wishes to accomplish, or how much of it that God simply allows to happen and doesn't do much with and then leaves it up to us to make our choices as to whether or not these things will matter in terms of who we are as believers. Jesus is moving in a trajectory here that is clearly orchestrated by God. The players outside of Jesus, Pontius Pilate, the Sanhedrin, the mob that's now following him, the guards, the Roman soldiers who are going to execute him, all of the pieces, Simon of Cyrene, whom we'll be looking at today, all of these pieces are in place. And God is moving these pieces around in order to accomplish this very culmination, in my mind, of all of human history, that there's this horizon in human history, and that horizon is, we're coming closer and closer to it as we come to Jesus' crucifixion and then subsequently His resurrection. All of Pilate's attempts to set Jesus free have failed. And now Jesus is going to bear that very last burden for the whole of humanity. So, I don't know whether COVID is God's doing, whether COVID is simply part of the fallen cosmos that is happening and God is using it to orchestrate things in ways outside of what COVID is actually accomplishing in the world in terms of the way it's shut the world down. I don't know the answer to that, or whether God is just watching all of this in human history. I don't know the answer, and I don't think anybody else does either. But I can say this: for every believer, the elements of human history are either wasted on us or they are not. And that is a lot to do with how we choose to look at them. So let's look at our text today. Our text comes from Luke chapter 23. I'll begin reading in verse 26. As they led Jesus away, they seized Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, probably there for Passover, no doubt. They placed the cross on Simon's back and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of people followed, and among them were women who were mourning and wailing for Jesus. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Israel, daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves and your children. For this is certain, there are days coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren. Blessed are wombs who have never borne children, or breasts who have never nursed.' They will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us up.' For if such things are done when the wood is green, what will happen when the wood is dry?" Jesus, in this moment, is condemned and is being led away in the way of the worst criminal possible. Now, this is very interesting. He's the worst criminal in the Roman system because only the worst criminals were crucified. There were other means of execution that were far more humane, if executing somebody can be said to be humane. Beheadings were common. But in this instance, crucifixion meant you were the worst criminal of the worst. And then you've got the Jewish perspective as well. The same thing. Anyone who's hung on a tree is cursed, according to Jewish understanding. And so these two features, for the Jewish mind, completely disqualify Jesus for being the Messiah. He cannot be the chosen one of God. He cannot be Emmanuel, God with us. He cannot be. For the Jewish mind, this settles the issue. And you know, I have to wonder And of course we know it's true that the disciples themselves were, some of them, disappointed in this same way. He is fitting the mold of the one who could not be the one called by God to be the Savior of the world, and much less the Savior of the Jewish nation. There's a protocol in crucifixion. The condemned are, Jesus has already been in the judgment hall in front of Pilate, all right? Once that period of judgment is over and the judgment has been passed that this person is to be executed by crucifixion, a quaternion, that is 4 Roman soldiers, would escort the condemned criminal out and surround him. They would then retrieve from wherever they kept such things the crossbeam that he was to be ultimately tied to or nailed to. They would lay it on the victim's shoulders, tie the victim's arms outstretched to the beam, and then make the condemned carry the beam on the route from where they were at the judgment hall to the place of crucifixion. And they would always choose the longest, most difficult route possible. And they did this because they wanted the public to see what happens when you defy Rome. They wanted to make a statement by this. This wasn't just an accident that they didn't know which way was the shortest way to the hill. They did this on purpose because they wanted as many people in the population as possible to see the placard that was carried. One of the soldiers would carry a placard with the condemned person's name on it and the charges for which they were being punished. They wanted everybody, the Romans wanted everybody to see this so that everybody would say, you know, you don't mess up or Rome's coming. Don't do the things that would cause Rome's attention to be focused on you, because this could be you. It was a placard saying, do not defy Rome. Now, Jesus could only be put to death as a capital crime for several different offenses. But in the case of Jesus, the Jews were very clever. They made sure that Jesus was treated or condemned as an insurrectionist, that is, a defier of Caesar. And that was the only charge the Jews could bring that really could stick in the Roman mind, because they didn't care about the other charges of blasphemy and the religious questions. None of that was of interest to them. Rome was all right with you as long as you paid your taxes and didn't create a riot. As long as there was no civil unrest focused on you and you paid your taxes, the Romans would leave you alone. They were happy with you as a citizen or as a subjugated group of people. They didn't really care. But if you did anything that defied Caesar or created civil unrest, they were coming. And so the Jews had chosen this charge of insurrection. And as I pointed out last week, they did so by threatening, in a sense, Pilate by saying, you're no friend of Caesar if you don't condemn this man. So Jesus is being put to capital death here for insurrection in the Roman mind. And of course, Jesus carries his cross, and at some point, he becomes so exhausted that he falls down with the cross. He stumbles. He can't carry it any further. Jesus really could have already been dead just by the beating and all that he's been through alone. You've got to remember that Jesus has been up for, 24, 36 hours. He's had no food. We don't know that he's had any water. He's been run from pillar to post through all of the various illegal trials. And now he's going to be condemned. And so he's been beaten within an inch of his life. You know, the lictors were very good at what they did. They knew when to stop. The 39 lashes plus 1 was the death. That was where you were going to be beaten to death. But they would stay back from it. The 39 is just an arbitrary number so far as I know. But they would stay back from it just enough. The lictors knew what to do to keep a person alive for crucifixion, and yet beat them within an inch of their life. But Jesus could have died, because Eusebius and Josephus both record the fact that in many instances people's entrails would be exposed. And once that happened, you're dead, because there was no surgery available at that time in history that could save your life. Simon is an interesting portion of this, and most of what I'm going to say today will be focused upon Simon of Cyrene. He's there for Passover. That means Simon, he's from Tripoli, Libya. Simon of Cyrene, that's Tripoli, modern-day Libya. He was there for Passover, which means coming from North Africa, he's come a great distance, and he's probably a proselyte. He's not an ethnic Jew, that's for sure, because he's from Cyrene, unless he had just been part of a Jewish family that had moved there for some reason. Likely as not, he isn't. And he is in Jerusalem for probably, given the distance that had to be traveled and the fact that at that time in history people didn't have any means of travel except an animal or on foot, plus having to carry your own provisions for such a journey, this is probably the only Passover he's ever going to attend. Many proselyte Jews from far-flung countries would hope to attend one Passover. So Simon is probably there for his Passover, the only one he'll ever attend. And all of a sudden, he's just minding his business. How he wound up on the Via Dolorosa, that is the way of where Jesus was walked to Golgotha, we don't know. That's another place where it seems clear to me that God is orchestrating things. But Simon is tapped for use by the Romans. Now this tapping is a very significant thing. We say that in our language. One of our idioms is, I tapped so-and-so to help me with this, or so-and-so was tapped by Congress to fill some office, whatever we say. That tapping is a very literal thing in the Roman Empire. What a Roman soldier would do would come along to somebody in a subjugated country. Now in any country that was subjugated by Rome, if the Romans wanted you to do something, you had to do it. You remember Jesus saying, if someone asks you to carry something for 1 mile, carry it 2. That's because the Romans were allowed to tap anybody to do anything they asked, and you were under obligation as a subject of Rome to do it. So what the soldier would do is reach out with their spear or their sword and tap you on the shoulder. They tapped Simon of Cyrene on the shoulder, and that meant we're calling you into some kind of duty. So imagine you're Simon. I mean, he's just hanging out. He's here for his Passover, and all of a sudden he finds himself wrapped up in something incredible that he can't understand himself. Jesus' appearance at this point, and it makes perfect sense to me that Jesus would succumb to the weight of the crossbeam. It probably weighed anywhere from 70 to 100 pounds. It was a heavy piece of wood. He has been through so much that this sense of exhaustion just seems perfectly natural to me, that he should fall in this way. Mel Gibson's movie, I've not seen the movie, The Passion of the Christ, because I don't want the imagery I have in my mind supplanted by the imagery that Mel Gibson made in his movie. However, I have seen the photographs, you can't miss them. If you walk through a grocery store, there they are, of the actor who portrayed Jesus after he had been scourged. Swollen eye, stripes on his body. That image is mild compared to what a real scourging and beating brought a person to look like. Isaiah says this, he says, just as many as were horrified by the sight of you because you were so disfigured, you no longer looked like a man. That means Jesus was beaten far beyond anything that Mel Gibson captured on the screen. And so when Jesus falls, it makes perfect sense. Now for those Roman soldiers, contrasted with Simon, this is all very routine. There were lots of crucifixions in the Roman Empire, and I don't know if they had a certain detachment of soldiers that were always at work on this, or if all the soldiers were trained for it. I don't know the answer to that. But all of them, as Roman soldiers, had seen crucifixions. This was a totally routine way to dispatch a capital criminal. And there was nothing here that said anything that would surprise the Roman soldier. Commonplace. But think about Simon. Simon is just there, minding his business, happy he's made it to Jerusalem for Passover week. Happy to be there, probably. And all of a sudden, he's been drawn into this nightmare. He's got to be confused, probably kind of angry. He's at a place for a sacred festival, and he's drawn into a horror. Now, I want to say, Simon, once he is handed the crossbeam, I don't know how he carried it. He probably carried it like anybody would carry a heavy load on one shoulder, switching shoulders from time to time. But there's Jesus in front of him, trudging along, He's got the crossbeam. You've got the soldier, member of the quaternion, the 4 soldiers that are surrounding all of this, carrying the placard that says the accused's name and the accused person's charges for which they're being executed. And Simon's walking with the group. Have you ever been caught up in something where you wanted to let people know around you, that's not me, this is not mine, right? You don't want anybody to know that you're associated with whatever it is that's going on. And so you try to distance yourself from it in some way. I can't help but think that Simon was of that very mindset, that he's just thinking to himself, look, man, I'm just carrying this thing for him. It's not me. Simon is symbolic in this in several different ways. For one, we in the West tend to associate Christianity as a Western understanding, a Western religion. We think that somehow Jesus and the West are so linked. They are linked, but we've got it backwards. The only reason the West is because of Christianity. Christianity is not a Western religion in the sense of, when it was in its formative years, Christianity was spread all over the place. You had North African Christians, you had Christians in the Byzantine Empire, you had Christians in the southern regions of Europe, you had Christians spread out all over. There was no Western culture at the time other than Rome. The Greco-Roman culture could be seen as a somewhat Western culture, but Christianity came in and modified all of that. So we aren't the owners as people in the West of Christianity. As a matter of fact, it is so powerful in its formative nature that Christianity has given us this country and its ethos. We think it commonplace that we have intrinsic rights. I don't know if you know what that is. It simply means that because we're born a human being, we have certain rights. The United Nations has their document, the Universal Document declaring what human rights ought to be. It's a great document, but it's grounded in absolutely nothing. We in the Western democracies, and especially America uniquely, have grounded the fact of human freedom in the fact that it was given to us by God to start with. It's already ours to own. The government does not confer it. That is so unique to us, and that is a gift of Christianity. It comes straight away from the fact that Jesus died for you, and Jesus died for me as individuals. The individual is more important than the nation because of what Jesus has done. And that creates the ethos that we enjoy in this country of individual intrinsic rights granted to us by our Creator, not granted to us by some government. They're given to us by the Creator. We own them at birth. That is unique. Europeans are kind of latecomers to Christianity, really. So that's the first place where Simon is symbolic in this text and in our understanding. But there's another place where he's even more symbolic, and this funnels all this down to where you and I live today. Simon, at least in my mind, is an example of what it is to follow Jesus. And literally. He bears the weight of the cross, and he bears what Paul calls the stigmata, the stigma, the marks of the cross. He's bearing the weight. Obviously, he's carrying the crossbeam. He's also bearing the stigma because people are looking at him too. He's associated now with this moment in history, even though he probably would like it known that he's not the one being crucified. So it brings me to a question. Simon is bearing the weight and the marks of the cross. If there's no weight or stigma to our following Jesus at all, are we really following him? That weight is both hard but also encouraging at the same time. Let me explain the encouraging portion of it. Coupled with the weight, I may have told you this story before, I'm just one human being. I only have so many stories. But there were some missionaries to the Sudan. This is back at the time when ISIL was at its peak in operations, setting up the new caliphate. And they were taking Western hostages, and what they would do is what they always did. They'd take the Western hostages, they would threaten to execute them after they demanded a certain ransom. They were doing it for income, right? Well, about 12 Christian missionaries were captured. They were in relief work in the Sudan because Sudan needs a lot of relief work. They were captured. The offer was made for ransom. We want this much money and we'll start setting them free. If you don't give us the ransom by X, then we're going to execute them one at a time. And sure enough, they did in the end execute one of them. But during that period of time, the missionaries were caught up in all of this, and they said, I want to volunteer to be the first one executed. They knew what was coming. They said, let me be the first one to go. I don't have any family at home. I'm single, all that. Well, the next missionary said, no, you can't do that. I'm an elder. Let me be the first executed. Another one said, well, you can't do that. I've been an elder for 10 years. Let me be the first one executed. The next one said, I'm one of the pastoral team. I'll take the first execution. They were arguing with each other about who was going to be first. They were rescued, except for one who was executed, as an example of what will happen if we don't pay us our ransom. The military, whatever military contingent it was that got in there, rescued them, pulled them out. After a couple of years back in the States in safety, they were getting together with each other on an anniversary basis. And they all said the same thing. We wish we could go back. Now that's, to me, just mind-boggling. I look at myself. I've got a refrigerator and air conditioning, and I have clothing. I have food in my stomach, plenty of water. If I'm thirsty, I just go turn on the tap. I don't worry about the basic necessities of life, and I sure don't worry about being taken hostage and being threatened with execution, and I don't think I really want to go there. These guys all said the same thing. We wish we could go back. You see, the stigmata and the weight of the cross is an encouraging thing, because this is what they said. We have never experienced the nearness of God like we experienced it during that time. We wish we could experience the nearness of God like that again. And they were willing to take on that horror just to be that close to God once again. So there's an encouragement, a huge blessing in taking on the stigmata and the weight of the cross. We know from the biblical record, given the fact that Simon is mentioned by virtue of his sons, Rufus and Alexander, Simon probably became a believer. Rufus and Alexander were. And Simon probably became a believer because of this day. Why mention him and his sons if he's not part of the family of God? I imagine that Simon looked back on this day as the day of his salvation. It was a horror when he was caught up in it, right? Horror, terrible thing. I'm minding my business. The Roman soldier taps me on the shoulder with his sword, and the next thing you know, I'm caught up in a parade that's going to Golgotha, and I'm trying to make sure that nobody thinks that it's me. But he probably looked back after time had passed as this being the day when he found something that was beyond any other treasure in his life. The women who are wailing are likely not to be followers of Jesus. These are professional wailers, not wailers as in Moby Dick, but wailers as in crying. They would come to funerals and things in the Semitic tradition, not just Jewish tradition, but in Semitic tradition. There would be women who would come to funerals and tragic events, and they would professionally wail to provide extra mourning for that particular terrible event. Jesus turns back to them who are doing this in like an Old Testament prophet. And the Old Testament way in which he speaks sounds just like something you might read from Amos. And he says to them, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves because of what is coming. If it's bad when the wood is green, it's going to be a lot worse than the wood is dry. That's a very confusing thing, but what he's saying is, look, Right now, everything's okay. But there's going to come a point where it's not okay. And the many people who are caught up in the judgment that is coming, the terrible things that are coming, some of them are innocent. Isn't that just like the world? For you and for me? People talk about, in our tradition, the rapture, as though the rapture is just a given. Do you know the rapture, the whole idea of the church being taken up prior to the persecutions and everything else, that's only 200 years old. Nobody thought that in the first 500 years of the church. Nobody even considered it. They'd seen too much. They had seen so many people martyred for their faith that wasn't even a remote consideration for them. This whole picture of Jesus telling them this is saying, look, this judgment is going to come, and some of you who are innocent will be caught up. Some of you who are green will be caught up in the dry. And that's just the way the world is. You know, God brought judgment to Israel many times. I guarantee you there were faithful followers of Yahweh during the period of judgment. Babylonian, the Syrian, whatever it was, the Persians, when they came in, there were people who were totally faithful, but they got caught up in all that was happening. It was a reproach for a woman to be childless in the Jewish ethos. It was terrible. Look back through the Old Testament and all the way into the New with Zechariah and Elizabeth. These Jewish women praying for God to grant them a child. So it was a disgrace for a Jewish woman to be, especially the wife of a priest in Zechariah's case. It was a disgrace for a Jewish woman to be without a child. But Jesus is saying being without a child will be preferable to what's coming. Not all who endure the destruction of God's judgment deserve it. And then I look at Jesus. He sure didn't deserve any of this. Now, these moments carry a lot of meaning for us, right? As believers, we centralize the whole of the Christian faith on the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And Jesus is paying the price here. This is the part of the whole atonement picture wherein the price for our wrongdoing, for the wrongdoing of the whole of humanity, is being paid in the suffering of the innocent. That's what this is all about. We are being granted an opportunity to be justified before God because of Jesus' suffering. But you know, we live in a time, and this is nothing new, where people really don't feel a need for mercy. Why do I need mercy? I remember reading and hearing Christopher Hitchens, the late atheist, writer of God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, how he said that he resented the fact of somebody paying the price for him. He related it to things like, I might pay your house payment for you or a car payment for you, but I wouldn't just give my life for you to expiate sin from your life. He said, that's crazy. And I resent the fact, he said, that I've been born sick and in need of some kind of cure by some horrible Jewish sacrifice, as he put it. Well, that reflects a heart that says, I don't want your mercy, God. I don't need it. I'm self-sufficient. And that looks to me like a lot of people whom I correspond with, a lot of people I meet in the street, they're just self-sufficient. And you know, the scary thing is there are a lot of Christians, a lot of people who say I'm a follower of Jesus who see themselves as self-sufficient like that. Like what we have, we earned. Well, yes, we may have worked and gotten it, but the only reason we were able to do that is because God gave us the grace. The text says that God upholds the universe by the word of his power. I would say that means if he withdraws that holding it up, that it'll all collapse. The only reason that I'm able to go out and do work is because God allows my body to function. There are a lot of people's bodies that don't function such that they can work. So we need to remember that. But the other aspect of this is we are not self-sufficient, no matter what we think. And this is where COVID and what we're going through right now serves a purpose, to my mind. It reminds us that we're not self-sufficient. It reminds us of our inadequacy, our complete inadequacy. All of the imperial achievements of humanity spread before us that have all been toppled by a germ that we can't even see. We're not self-sufficient at all. The great tragedy for humanity today is that we toy with the need for mercy. And the real tragedy, the deeper tragedy, is we who say we are followers of Jesus toy with it. What do I mean? The obvious is in the ridicule of the cross that we see in the secular community, right? The terrible things that are said about Jesus and his sacrifice and all of that. But I'm not talking about that. That we know what that means. I'm talking about for you and for me who say we are followers of Jesus. Look at the flippant way in which we treat the only real expression we have in this world that tells the world that we are followers of Jesus. What do I mean? Well, most of you who are viewing this will not become missionaries like those missionaries to the Sudan. You might, but you probably won't. Most of us will not have our lives put on the line for the sake of the testimony of being a believer. Some do, but most don't. So what is our expression? Our expression is the one physical act that we perform that says to those who don't believe that we do believe. And that is we attend a gathering. The Bible makes that command, do not forsake the gathering together of yourselves, as is the habit of some. It says that not as some kind of empty command, that this is just part of Christian practice, though it is part of Christian practice. It's saying something much, much deeper than that. It's saying that in order for us to flourish as believers, we need the gathering. That's what makes this moment with COVID so poignant for us. We're not able to gather. But when we have been able to gather for most of history, most of my history, I'm 61, and I've never seen anything like this where I wasn't able to go. I could not go and gather. When we could, there are many who don't. And yet, they say, I'm a follower of Jesus. The local body, the commitment to it, gets neglected. Just as the writer to the letter to the Hebrews says, as is the habit of some. So let me ask all of us today, what does that say about whether or not we really are followers of Jesus? We're not willing to bear even the light burden of faithfully participating with a body of believers in a gathering. It just seems like God's not asking that much of us, really. And we wonder sometimes why God's presence doesn't seem so real and why we feel so dry sometimes. If we're not willing to bear the stigmata and the weight of the cross, then I think it's a healthy thing to do to get alone and spend a little time thinking as to whether or not I'm even a follower of Jesus at all. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything, you have questions about what I've said, you disagree with it, you'd like to talk to me about it, I'm available. You know how to get a hold of me. And of course, the comment section at the end of the sermon is always available to anyone. I would hope that you would reflect on these things and really reflect on the fact of where you and I are in terms of whether or not we're willing to bear the weight and the stigmata. As Jesus said, if we want to be his disciple, we've got to deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow him every day. If we're not willing to make the small sacrifice of participating in a local congregational body of believers, which the Bible commands us to do, then I have to ask that question. Are we really followers of Jesus? Would you pray with me, please? Lord, condemnation and guilt are not good motivators. And I surely don't want to be one to bring guilt or condemnation to anyone. But the text is what it is. Simon was willing to bear not only the weight of the cross, but the stigma that went with it as well. And so many of us, Lord, are just not willing to do that. And the only expression that we really have that says to this world, we are your followers, and that is that we would participate faithfully in a congregational body. We can't right now. My prayer is, Father, that once the COVID restrictions are lifted and we're back to business as usual insofar as gathering, that we would take advantage of that, embrace that, look to that, and allow it to cause us to flourish as real followers of you, that we would take on that little portion of the weight and the stigma of the cross. Help us to do that, Lord, and we thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all so much for your attention today. I hope to be with you in person as soon as is possible. Thank you for your attention.